Hello to my students of Intro to Mass Communication here at St. John's. I thank you for being here. We are starting our speaker series where I'm introducing you to some of the professionals in the mass media industry. Some of those industries that we've been discussing in class, you get to meet them and hear from them and hear about their experiences in the field and hear about, get a little bit more information about what it's like to work in those industries and perhaps what the future is like for that industry with you in it. And so we're going to start today with Theresa Braine, who is with the New York Daily News. Hi, Theresa. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Professor Bonner.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for being here and helping my students to understand a little bit more about what it's like to work in the newspaper industry in today's society. And I wanted to just start out with you just hearing a little bit about your past work in the field and what you're doing now with the Daily News.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, and journalism has been a passion of mine for a long time, so I'm glad to impart what I know. At the Daily News, I work on the national desk. Our job is to write stories on topics that are either outright newsworthy, or since we're a tabloid, we have to have an element of it for it to be offbeat enough to call attention to the weirdness of the world. And there's plenty of that going on, even, anytime. So it makes it kind of fun. So I've written about everything from different stories on the coronavirus pandemic to yesterday I wrote about a guy who used Reddit to find to gift a car to someone in need. So it's a huge range of topics. I've written obituaries and crime.
Now, can you define what you mean by national desk? What is the national desk? How is that different from other departments within the newspaper? What is the national desk?
Well, we cover things that happen all over the country. There's a metro desk whose their job is actually completely different. It's more traditional reporting in that they're out in the field. We do everything by phone and internet. And so we're purely digital, basically. Some of our stories end up in print. There's the Metro desk where they're all out covering the courts. They're covering the city, basically. So they're literally in the streets. And then there's the politics desk. And so they're a hybrid. They write everything, excuse me, everything that's going on in the political scene. That includes local politics, New York City politics. So we have a guy in Albany, it's also state. So it's a mixture. The people covering the national, I don't think we have anyone physically in Washington right now. So
but your job is basically digital. You basically work digitally. So you're not in the newsroom. You're not in the newsroom writing stories that will appear in a physical copy of a paper.
Right. Most of them don't. Some of them do when they fall into a certain news category. Or I'm trying to remember. The one I won recently was when the head of the World Health Organization announced he was quarantining because he'd been exposed to coronavirus. That went in the physical paper. So there's certain stories that do end up there, but most of our stuff is just solely online.
Great. Now tell me a little bit about your past work. Before we get a little bit more into your work at the Daily News, tell me a little bit about your past work in journalism.
Yeah, well, I started writing as a little kid, and then I got interested in high school and college into doing it as a profession. When I got out of college, I did some internships, and I was also proofreading at some magazines. And then I went to graduate school for journalism and got a master's. And then after that, I left New York City and went to Connecticut. I wanted to write for small newspapers and be an on-the-ground reporter, and that wasn't really possible in New York City because it's such a big market. It's most experienced people, at least back, mainly back then. So I did that for 7 years, and then I moved back to New York City, and the world was starting to go digital. And I was working for a newspaper that didn't end up launching, but it was going to be the first digital newspaper. I was doing business reporting and copy editing for them, and then I ended up back in copy editing, and I was working at Sports Illustrated and some other Time Inc. magazines. And then I got laid off from there. Journalism is pretty volatile. I've been laid off a number of times. I always seem to bounce back. And then I used the severance money as seed money to move to Mexico. It was a long-held dream of mine to report internationally. So I lived in Mexico for 7 years, and I wrote all kinds of things for all kinds of outlets. Um, and then I moved back to New York City, and I ended up working for a website that was covering indigenous issues. And an Indian tribe had hired a team of us in New York to bring higher visibility to those issues and put them on the national radar. And so I think we did succeed in doing that, at least to some extent. And also showcasing Native writers. And so and then I learned a lot from all of that, and that was really fascinating. And I was the environment editor and Canada editor there. And then after that was another layoff, that ended in another layoff. And then I got the job at the Daily News 2 years ago this month, actually. Started November 5th.
Of what year did you start at the Daily News?
2018.
Okay. Okay. This takes me to my next question for you, because I know you mentioned your experience of sort of entering this new world of journalism that is now digital, that is now emphasis on digital. So I would like you to describe for me how the digital journalism space is different, from traditional print journalism. Can you just tell us how that's different?
Yeah, well, in one sense, it's the same in that you're reporting and you're writing, and it just gets published in a different medium, not necessarily on paper. In another, like the main difference I see in digital journalism is that you have to resort to different methods to get people's attention, to get the stories read. In the old days, the newsstand headlines would grab people's attention, and they would buy it, or the voice of, well, that's still happening. I guess the voice of the outlet also attracts people. And so that would, quote, grab eyeballs and cause people to buy a paper. Nowadays online, you have to get your story to come up in search results. So the search engines have to see it so that when somebody searches for something that you've written, that on the topic you've written about, your story comes up and they see it. And so that's where search engine optimization, SEO, comes in. So I feel like that's the main difference in terms of the mechanics of print digital journalism. And of course, there's also, all the different social media platforms. So whether you're doing digital reporting for a digital outlet or a traditional outlet, you have to sort of take those into account and figure out how to vet all that to see if it's genuine people commenting, and make news judgments as to whether you use those tweets or Instagram comments or whatever. And so that's also another facet.
Sure. How has digital changed journalism? You've been able to be in a unique position of experiencing both worlds, the world of traditional print newspaper journalism, and now we're in this new age of a lot of digital journalism. How has digital changed journalism, the field of journalism, newspaper journalism?
Well, it's been good in that it's allowed for a greater breadth of reporting, since you don't always have to be in the location that you're reporting about. And you're always obviously upfront about whether you're there or not. You don't pretend to be there, but you can find out stuff about a place without having to be in it. The downside is that journalism has been lumped under the umbrella of content. So it's been commodified as something that needs to be monetized and sold. And on one hand, it is necessary to be self-supporting financially, to have some kind of funding source. On the other hand, the function of journalism as a public service and a cornerstone of democracy can get a bit lost in that environment.
What do you mean by monetized? Can you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by journalism being monetized, being a commodity? Can you just sort of elaborate on what you mean, how that is evident in today's world of journalism, print journalism?
Well, I know I can speak to how it works at my job. We do some stories that we know will just get clicks, and the more clicks you get, supposedly the more money comes to the site. In the old days, a magazine or newspaper circulation would determine the ad rates, and that would help keep secure revenue coming in. Nowadays, and there's also a lot of profit motive where that was always in place, but now, like a distressing trend is there's a lot of hedge funds coming in and buying up newspapers, chains, and just sort of selling it off as if we're treating our stories as if we're making widgets to be sold. And so that doesn't always serve, it's not, the direct agenda isn't always to serve the public interest. And really the passion of journalism is about telling stories of people who are not on the mainstream radar, and, just bringing forth a lot of different elements that don't necessarily earn money. And so the goal isn't to earn money, it's to provide information that people need.
So you mentioned you started talking about the advertising rates and how it used to be and how it's different. Can you kind of finish that thought and let us know, like, the advertising rates were determined by circulation before, and now how is that determined?
So now it's determined by like clicks are sort of the new circulation. But the thing with that is they're very volatile, and so you're always being driven to like make sure you have a lot of clicks. And so I think it's a lot more volatile. I mean, reporters, we're not totally in on the financial aspect. Traditionally, there was a sort of separation of church and state in terms of publishing being walled off from editorial, so that there was no sort of cross-contamination, not contamination, but so that the reporting could be totally independent and not influenced by financial concerns. So some of that is part of what gets lost in the new environment, and at least in the way it's being interpreted nowadays. Yeah, I hope that's.
And what is that? I know you started to talk about that, but I just wanted you to say a little bit more about what that means for, if the digital space is being driven in a different way today, what does that mean for the journalism itself? And this what does it mean for journalism itself in this dissemination of news to the general public? What does that mean? If it's about clicks, what does it mean?
Yeah, it means that it makes our job harder in terms of, like, for instance, me personally, I'm pressured to write 5 stories a day, and I am always, like, yesterday I had a couple stories that just needed more research than just being able to spit something out. I could write about the guy with the car really fast, but were a couple stories about death rates from people who don't have COVID, but rising death rates, especially in nursing homes, that I just felt, they needed more time and more space. So I gave it to them. I know that my editors probably would have liked me to do 2 paragraphs and just get out. So there's a lot of pressure to do those more superficial stories, basically. And with a quota of, this might be just my newspaper, but a lot of places actually do require this. You have to produce volume. And again, it's for the clicks. And so it just kind of, it robs journalism of its quality. So unless you're really like pushing to do extra, which a lot of people do.
Wow, that's very interesting. We talk a little bit about that in class and about the impact of digital, especially the impact on the advertising revenue. So it's good to hear, from you from the inside in terms of what that translates to, what that actually looks like. I know you've kind of touched on this, but I just wanted to kind of reiterate a little bit, go back a little bit when you said talk about the impact of digital on journalism, good and bad. Are there some good aspects to this new focus on digital, and what are some of the negatives, positives and negatives?
Yeah, sorry, that WebEx sent me some weird message. I'm ignoring it, but can you just repeat your question?
Oh, sure. So my question is, what is the impact of digital on journalism, good and bad, like the positives and the negatives? What is the impact of this new focus on the digital platform for dissemination of news?
Well, we can disseminate it much more widely. I know that I have readers all over the place now, and they write to us. That's another aspect of the digital, there's less of a barrier between you and the rest of the public, and journalists are it's supposed to be more of a behind the scenes thing, so people can write to you directly. So that can be good and bad. Sometimes they send you useful corrections, and sometimes they just, want to abuse you, or, say crappy things, not nice things. Either one's fine. It works. And then in terms of disseminating, that's the good in that more people can access your work. I guess.
As opposed to just being in one location and picking up a newspaper, you have to be there to get the newspaper.
Yeah.
Digital expands that space, right?
Exactly. And in terms of that, so what were you asking in terms of
the impact of digital journalism, the impact, the good and the bad, the positives and the negatives of having this shift to the digital? What are the positives? What are the negatives? You answer the positives, so I guess you were going to go into the negatives of that.
Yeah, well, it used to be said, it's a popular, like an adage, a saying that journalists write the first draft of history. But now that's been changed, that's been tweaked. I've seen a different saying come to the fore. Social media writes the first draft. Journalism writes the second draft. And our job can be made more difficult in terms of, we're now not just interviewing people and getting the story and putting it out there. We have to sort through all piles and piles of misinformation to get A, to the truth, and B, how do you get people to believe it? There's so much misinformation about coronavirus, about the vaccines, about the election, and even in a year where that's not happening, that's just a whole other layer that we have to sort through. So if you're talking to somebody one-on-one, you can maybe tell if they're lying, or if they're enough of an expert. And so it just makes things a little bit more tricky in terms of reporting.
So you're saying you're having to compete with social media?
Yeah, I wouldn't say compete, but try to correct any misconceptions that come over social media. And then it's hard when there's, the whole backdrop of don't trust the press. That's a whole other deal. So I think verifying what's actually genuine for readers and for ourselves is tougher. And so that makes it, I think that's a difficulty that comes up.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Daily News specifically, because I know that, the Daily News is taking some hits. I showed in my class when we were talking about newspaper journalism. Showed them the layoffs that happened, the mass layoffs that happened, a little bit ago, a few years ago. And I wanted you to just talk about, some of the, the hits that the Daily News has taken, from the layoffs to losing this physical building early this year. Like, what have been some of the contributing factors of some of that, and how have you been coping, through all of this, changing environment with the Daily News?
It's certainly a roller coaster ride. I mean, journalism is always somewhat volatile. I've been laid off several times because all these different things keep happening and shifting, corporate takeovers and blah, blah, blah. I was hired right after the huge layoffs, so I didn't experience them directly. But I do know that there was definitely tension when I started, and something had been lost. It kind of ripped apart this community, the good and the bad. As one person who survived the layoffs recently put it, they cut the heart out of the newsroom. I mean, it really, it can mess with the energy. And then the other thing is that right before those layoffs, the Daily News had changed hands a few times and was ending up with Tribune Publishing. And they're not really a tabloid newspaper, so they don't really get us anyway. But so that was it's just very corporate now. And so I think it was much more scrappy and, sort of out in the streets. And it still is that, but it's all been very diluted. And then in terms of doing without a newsroom. It was strange. We've been working from home since mid-March, and that was always strange, but very necessary to keep everyone safe, especially on the national desk because we're mostly digital. In one sense, it hasn't really changed anything. On the other hand, it's very strange knowing that we don't have a newsroom to go back to. Like we all had this idea that we're going to go back, had something to go back to. It's like you move out for college and you come home and your parents rented out your room.
So what happened? Can you just take us back? Like what happened? So you had a physical space. You all were on quarantine, obviously,
Yeah,
or working from home because
right.
of COVID-19. So we should just be clear of that.
Yeah.
And then you had a physical space, and then all of a sudden you didn't. Well, can you just describe like how did that happen? And what did how what happened? And what impact does this have on you not having a physical space? What does that mean to not have a physical space?
Yeah. Well, in terms of physical space of a newsroom, there's definitely like an energy, the reporters and their energy feeds off each other. We're always excited about the story. So you're like talking, there's back and forth. I used to sit near the print guys and they would be yelling across the room to the Metro desk and figuring out what the front page would be. And, tossing back all those great headlines that end up on the front page. First, they would fly around behind my head. So there's just like a lot of this energy is just gone. And the so that's definitely a physical aspect of it that's missing. Um, in terms of the actual announcement and everything itself, it was very strange and it's super surreal. I mean, I literally happened to be in the office that day, not knowing anything that there was no the meeting was called like pretty close to the announcement. So I happened to be there. And so it was just very strange. I ended up just like, I might as well clean out my desk because this was in, I don't know, August or September. And they made the announcement and you did feel like something right in the pit of your stomach. No. And a lot of people who've been there much longer than me, it's like a home to them. They've been through a lot in that space. They had to leave it briefly during Sandy because it was in downtown Manhattan and it got trashed and they came back after all the repairs and they've been through a lot together. So it's very sad and it's strange. There's a disconnect, to not having the physical space. So that was just very weird in terms of my personal situation. So now I've blocked off. You see behind me shelves. Behind that are my two monitors. I literally just took my workstation home in an Uber and set it up in my living room, which I already had an office corner, but now it's like as separate as I can make it, so that work doesn't take over your life. I know a lot of people are in situations where they can't necessarily do that. So you have your work in your face all the time. And that's just my job before this was like that. And that was no fun.
Now, how long had the Daily News been in the building before? How long had it been located in that space
I
before?
think since 2011.
Okay. So it
They've
had
been,
been a little bit. It had been a little bit.
yeah, it had been a little bit,
Is
not
it?
traditional original headquarters, but
Do you think that is? Do you think that you all will get another space? Do you think that there is a push to sort of not have a physical space in for newspapers to kind of cut that out? Do you feel that that's the future? That's where we're going?
um, you know, in terms of us, I think they do want to have a space at some point. They were starting to look for a temporary one, but just kind of realizing that there was no way to do it safely. So they're sort of put it on hold, I think. We're not privy to all the details, but my sense is that that's what's happening. I can tell you that I think it was McClatchy, one of the major chains, just disseminated their entire newsroom. And that's just sort of, it's a bad trend. I mean, it shows a lack of understanding of what really goes into getting the news out there. You're kind of robbed of the dynamic I was just describing. And so,
Yeah, I remember those days. The energy would drive you. Being
yeah,
inside a newsroom really it gave that adrenaline, the energy that was just bursting all around you from different departments and things happening. And you sort of fed on that. It kept you, your energy levels up. So for me, I would see it, I would think it would be difficult, to sort of work outside of that, to really, I don't know. It's just a different world.
That's it. Like you exchange ideas. You even can help each other on stories. Like now, if I need someone to eyeball it before I send it to the editor, I'm like, send a friend a message on Slack. Can you read this for me? Totally not the same. even if you were, even if you were communicating by Slack in the newsroom, you still could see the person.
Right.
So now, this person's over in Jersey or something, and I'm not.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah.
And that's interesting too, because you mentioned the metro people who usually are out in the fields and things like that. It could take them farther away from the places they cover. It can create a little bit of, to me, I don't know, it may possibly you have a different view, but would it create some sort of distance between those people who are uh covering those communities and those communities themselves?
Interesting question. My sense from talking to some of them is they're not there. That distance isn't happening. What they're missing is a landing spot because they still are out in the streets. They're committed to that. They can't really do their job any other way. And they just don't have a newsroom to go back to write their stories. If they were going to do that, sometimes they're off somewhere and they just do it by laptop anyway. But so that hasn't changed that aspect for them because they're not doing that from their homes. But I feel like maybe with the politics desk, to have that energy in one room would have been pretty important, especially for this election. And I kind of think they're sort of heroes because, I mean, I can't imagine that they're on Zoom together all the time while they do the reporting. And they've been doing amazing work, tons of stories. I mean, with everything happening. So I'm actually in awe of them because it adds a layer of difficulty and strips away a layer of, I would think, camaraderie to an extent, which is very essential to cohesive coverage in newsrooms. So
That's interesting when you talk about that, like what was like to cover an election without a newsroom. That's very interesting. Um, I mean, that's something people probably wouldn't even be aware of. People who are not inside journalism understanding and how difficult that probably would have been for you all. Thinking about that in terms of covering how what was your experience and the experience of daily news and covering these major events? We had a lot of major events this year in 2020. From the pandemic to the protests to the election. How was journalism able to respond to that? How were you able to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I wanted to clarify. I'm not on the politics desk, so I didn't
Right.
firsthand. Yeah, so but yeah, it was often just overwhelming. There was so much going on, and so you would sit down at your desk and be busy the entire day. Um, and I have a boss, the national editor. She's great at finding those offbeat stories that draw in clicks, and so you'd get a bunch of those thrown at you. Sometimes I'd find my own stories. Um, you'd be sitting in on press conferences online. You'd be downloading press releases or hunting through a transcript of like the 2-hour World Health Organization daily briefing to get the information that was needed to impart to readers the latest on the pandemic and the virus. There have been a lot of times, like just this past week, waiting for the Johns Hopkins website to officially come to say 250,000 deaths. And so you write a story ahead of time, and as soon as it happens, you post it because it's headed there. So yeah, there's just been a lot. And a lot, you're reviewing to do the national part, you're reviewing lots of different videos. So it's hard to figure out what really was happening because you're not there. So you're trying to give as truthful a representation as possible. And, some of them are posted with zero context. And it looks like one thing happened when really something completely different happened. And that's also hard to ascertain what really was going on. And so
Interesting. So I wanted to ask you, we talk a lot about in our class when we look at the different fields in mass communication, all of the different industries. We talk a lot about diversity and what that looks like or doesn't look like in these different industries. And, we look at it, in terms of newspapers as well. And I wanted to ask you about diversity in newspaper industry, what that looks like, what it looks like perhaps within the daily news. We can start there.
Well, yeah, in the Daily News, it is very white, and I oh, you're still there? Okay.
Yes. Sorry. We had back home
Great.
we had a little bit of a yeah, but we're back. Go ahead.
Okay. Um, yeah, so there are definite issues. A lot of the Metro staff, including, as somebody mentioned recently, all the court reporters are white. Um, so we could definitely use more diversity. My An editor who has since left did mention to me at one point when I first started, um, he was not a proponent of the 5 story a day quota. He was saying that they had lost a lot of diversity during the mass layoffs, and not intentionally, it's just a byproduct, but the effect is the same, so that's still just as bad. Um, since the protest started, the upper management in Tribune Publishing, which is our parent company, they've been reaching out on these issues. At the Daily News, they started a committee to study diversity issues in newsroom culture, and that we did things like discuss whether to capitalize the word Black when we're covering, um, in coverage, and we're also trying to look at how we cover stories and um, what gets covered and how it's framed. We didn't delve too deeply into that. We also are looking at issues on LGBTQ coverage and how to understand all the issues that play into that. So looking at a number of issues, basically. Tribune's management has been saying they plan to provide seminars and training with the Maynard Institute, which is an organization dedicated to diversity training and newsroom change. So we are still in a process. They haven't really told us what they're doing yet, but that's something that they've been talking about. Even in these times, they're willing to budget money for that. And they also sponsored some panels, 2 panels surrounding the election run by Tribune employees of color. They were discussing various issues concerning Black voters that are of concern to Black voters. So in their corporate way, they're trying to do these things. And so hopefully it's an evolving process that we can keep moving forward on. Um,
Yeah, I'm just always amazed because when I was back in journalism in the 80s, in the 90s, there was still a diversity problem, and it's to me it's a little bit surprising that we're still having these conversations about journalism and about the newsrooms, all these decades later, because it seems like things have not changed much since I was actively working as a reporter myself. So I wonder, just your perspective. What is the challenge in terms of actually achieving diversity as opposed to why are we still working on it decades later? What do you think are the challenges?
so interesting. Yeah. Um, I don't know. I feel like I have a friend she's the only manager of color at this another major news outlet. And it's just like she runs into this just complete wall of lack of understanding of what's wrong and what needs to be addressed. And I think something that stuck in my mind at a panel that I attended right after, like what was it, sometime in the spring, and it was about. It was run by journalists of color, and it was about how to incorporate Black Lives Matter into coverage without appearing partisan. Which the obvious answer is they do matter. So it's not a political statement. But then how do you? So basically how to cover these issues and reframe them in ways that just show the truth of them. And this one woman who used to be, she's a woman of color who used to be at I think she moved on, but she was at a high profile news outlet. She said that what she ran into was this idea of white as default human. So white people, we tend to think of our experience as everyone's experience. And just that leaves, it's hard to let in. I don't know if this is answering your question.
Well,
But
I mean, I guess what we're, I guess, what I'm asking is really, about just the industry itself and why is it so difficult to achieve the diversity in the newspaper industry? Um, why that's difficult. What are some of the challenges? Um, again, I just,
yeah,
I think there was a study done, at some point several years ago that showed that there's less diversity in news journalism than there was decades ago. That it's actually reverted. It actually has not gotten better. It's gotten worse.
yeah, I know. Well, it's hard to speak to specific
Right.
newsrooms and the industry as a whole. But so I was trying to talk to like the mindset that I think is at play, which might be somewhat my opinion, but it's just sort of what I sense.
Yeah, because it's interesting that people, consider saying that someone's lives matter is a political issue. It's that's funny to me. It's like, oh, okay,
I know.
when we say somebody's life being mattering, is how is that political? That's
Well, it's not
right.
exactly. And so
Interesting.
that's not related to hiring specifically, but yeah,
It
just
is actually in a way because if you're going to hire a person a black person, or say work for a newspaper, and you don't see that their lives matter, and you see that their lives, because they are black, they are journalists, but they're black, and you don't see that their lives, and you feel their existence is a political statement, that does matter because that's going to impact how they get treated in the newsroom, how their voices, whether their voices get heard or not. So it is actually about hiring and about retention. Because if you have to be in a newsroom, people who don't get that, it can be a very, very uh, discouraging, experience, demoralizing experience.
yeah, yeah, yeah. My sense about people who don't understand that is that they don't realize the degree to which that's not seen. They assume that everyone already thinks Black Lives Matter, I think, and they don't realize that it's not set up for that. So it's getting through to people with that understanding.
Yeah.
That's key. And yeah, for sure, it could be definitely demoralizing. And yeah, it's tough because I don't know that we're hiring now. A couple of people have left. I am going to lobby for a person of color to be hired. And a woman of color. We do have people of color on our staff, predominantly not, but on the national desk, we do. Yeah,
Okay.
it's hard to know how to bridge the gap. There's a definite problem. I mean, it's predominantly white. My friend who's in management, which I'm not, has run into this sort of mindset that how do you get inside that? And
Yeah. So obviously, these things are. It's more. It's not really all about hiring folks, as you were pointing out. It's so much deeper than that. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So people know
easy.
coming into the industry that this is. These are some of the challenges they may face and some of the conversations they may want to open up as future professionals in that industry. And speaking of which, what do you think is the future of print journalism specifically? What do you think is the future of it?
Yeah.
Is
Well,
there a future? Will it survive?
I hope so. I mean, there's something about the tactile sensation of picking up a newspaper or magazine and leafing through that's not, not everything can be electronic. Like, we're not robots. We shouldn't be trying to be robots. Um, Writing and reporting will always be necessary. So the uncertainty lies in how it'll be consumed and disseminated. Um, so I would like to see newspapers continue to be printed, and I think many will. Same with magazines. But as costs continue to be cut, and who knows what's going to happen? Like, a lot of places do go digital. So that's kind of distressing, because part of the character of something like the Daily News would be nothing without its print. It's the tabloid. They're next to the Post. They go head to head, and if they're both on the newsstand, and if we have amazing front pages. We had a hall, which it's all in storage now, sadly, a hall lined with photos, giant posters of amazing front pages, like Ford to City dropped dead in the 1970s. And
Yeah, I have to say that when President Obama won the election the first time, being the first black person to do so, I collected newspaper covers, newspapers from different places, like from Chicago, my hometown. I had the New York papers, and I had some papers from other states, and saw the different ways that they described this historic event. And I still have those, and I have them somewhere stored, probably not the proper way to store newspapers, but stored somewhere in boxes. It's another conversation, like how to properly store. They're somewhere, and they're still in their little plastic covers, plastic over them, and they're treasures to me. You can't get that experience just online, in my opinion. That's. I look
exactly.
forward to framing them. You know.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something else that's lost when it's all, digitized and commodified. And so I don't know. I hope the pendulum swings back. There's also all the environmental concerns of printing on paper and trees, and so there's a lot at play. So I mean, that's often not the decision in corporate land to go digital is always about overhead rather than caring about the environment. But yeah, oh, that's another thing I can say about the bad with digital is way back when websites started cropping up and people did start going digital, publications did, they decided that, they were like cutting their overhead, man, you didn't have to pay writers as much. And it's like, well, we're still doing the same thing. It's just a matter of where you paste the words. But that didn't seem to filter through. So there's been a big fight to not have writers' wages and salaries eroded because their overheads reduced. I mean, that should have given us more money, really. But
Your office is now your home. So.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking in terms of the bigger picture, but yeah, in terms of this, we're also lobbying, like we're trying to figure out what kind of, compensation we can get. A lot of us are using resources at home that we never did, weren't before. So that is a whole other area where we haven't gotten extra money. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So last question is, what should students do to prepare for a career in journalism? Those of us who in this class, or who might be considering this, what do they need to do? How can they make sure they're ready?
Yeah. I would say, especially in light of what's going on these days, to get, and I'm doing this too, like reviewing everything I ever learned, give yourselves a very thorough civic education on how government works, how the electoral process works, read the Constitution and study it. There's a lot being done to try to undermine all these things that were supposedly put in place for us, for freedom, which is really, I think, to a large extent, comfort. So it's important because then it's easier to sort out any misinformation coming over about what the process should be, whether something is ironclad or is fraudulent. There's a lot of ways to learn about that. So the country's founding documents, and educate yourself, on all those things. That will help to inoculate you to some degree against misinformation coming out. In terms of, let's see, what I did, you want to write a lot. I used to write a lot as a kid, all the time, just as a practice. um, yeah, in terms of journalism, you don't need to get like a degree in it because journalism is writing about life. So you can't really get a degree about life. Um, you can read, there's some textbooks that are great. You're probably already studying some of them with Professor Bonner, I'm sure. Um, Melvin Mencher's book on news reporting and writing is a classic textbook that he's a professor emeritus now at Columbia University. And I think just read all the good journalism you can read. Do a lot of that.
Are there some skills that people need that they would not, that they would be surprised that would make them more marketable or more competitive in terms of entering into the field of journalism? Are there some skills that people wouldn't think they would need to be a good journalist?
Interesting. It's good to be a good listener. Interviewing people, and you really want to absorb what they're saying so that you
Right.
take yourself out of it and present what they want the world to know. So you have to be a really good listener, and learn how to put aside any sort of judgments you might be making at the back of your mind and just let what they're telling you sink in.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, it's just great. I mean, I thank you so much, for your time today and helping us to get a little bit more of a glimpse into the world of newspaper journalism. And we really appreciate that. And, if the students have any questions, would it be okay to shoot you some of those questions and then I can get some of your answers to those questions and I can filter it back to them?
For sure. It would be my pleasure. And
Yeah.
I love talking about journalism. I'm really happy that people want to know about it and practice it into the future because we need journalism. As you can see, they're sort of journalists now are holding up the Constitution by reporting accurately on what's going on with the attempt to subvert the election. And so there's an example right there. So thank you for being interested.
No, thank you. And hopefully this will inspire some of my students to give it a second look or even a first look as a potential field in the future. So yes, thank you so much, Theresa. I really appreciate your time and we will see you soon. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.